The map of us. The rain in the city of Oakhaven didn't just fall. It whispered. It tapped against the cobblestones and streaked down the fogged-up windows of the local cafes, wrapping the city in a gray, comforting blanket. For Elara, the rain was a symphony. It was the perfect excuse to lose herself in the scent of old paper and leather bindings. Elara was a restorer of antique books. She spent her days breathing life back into forgotten stories, delicately mending torn pages and polishing faded gold leaf. She was a woman who believed that the most beautiful things in the world were the things that had survived the test of time. One particular Tuesday, the rain was heavier than usual, driving Elara into a shop she had walked past 100 times but never entered, the Astrolabe. It was an antique store specializing in old navigational tools, compasses, sextants, and maps. As she pushed the heavy oak door open, a small brass bell chimed above her. The air inside was warm, smelling of cedarwood and Earl Grey tea, and standing behind the glass counter, polishing a brass telescope, was Julian. Julian possessed the quiet stillness of a man who spent more time with objects than with people. He had kind, dark eyes, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and hands that moved with practiced precision. He looked up as the bell chimed. "Miserable weather for a walk," he said, his voice a low, rich baritone that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. "Perfect weather for getting lost," Elara replied, shaking the rain from her umbrella. She began to wander the aisles, her fingers lightly trailing over the glass displays. She stopped at the very back of the shop, her eyes caught by a large, framed map hanging on the wall. It wasn't a map of a country or an ocean. It was a hand-drawn, intricate map of a mythical city, filled with impossibly tall towers, winding rivers, and tiny, meticulous annotations written in a language she didn't recognize. Julian stepped up quietly beside her. "The city of Ethelgard," he murmured. "Drawn by an unknown artist in the late 1800s, it's completely fictional." "It's beautiful," Elara whispered, captivated by the delicate inkwork, "but it's unfinished." She pointed to the lower right corner. Where there should have been a compass rose and the final southern districts of the city, there was only blank, yellowed parchment. "Yes," Julian said softly. He looked at her, and for a moment the quiet of the shop seemed to deepen. "I've always wondered what was supposed to go there, what the artist was looking for when they stopped drawing." "Maybe," Elara said, looking back at the map, "they just hadn't found it yet." That rainy Tuesday became a Wednesday, and then a Thursday. Elara found herself returning to the Astrolabe with an antique book in her bag, sitting in a worn velvet armchair by the window, while Julian worked at his counter. They existed in a comfortable silence, accompanied only by the ticking of grandfather clocks and the steady drumming of the rain. Slowly, the silence gave way to conversation. Julian learned that Elara liked her tea with a drop of honey, that she hummed when she was concentrating, and that she believed every book had a soul. Elara learned that Julian had inherited the shop from his grandfather, that he could navigate by the stars, and that his smile, rare but genuine, could light up the dimmest corners of the room. Weeks turned into months. The autumn chill softened into winter snow. Their conversations became longer, deeper. They talked about their dreams, their fears, the places they wanted to travel, and the places they felt they belonged. They began to share a routine. Julian would close the shop early on Fridays, and they would sit on the floor in the back room, surrounded by maps, eating takeout under the warm glow of a single brass lamp. Elara realized with a quiet, terrifying certainty that she was falling in love. It wasn't a sudden, crashing wave. It was like the rising tide, slow, silent, until suddenly she was completely submerged. But there was a hesitation between them. A fragile, unspoken line that neither dared to cross, terrified that shifting the balance would shatter the beautiful sanctuary they had built. By late spring, Elara received a commission she couldn't refuse, a 3-month residency in a library in Rome, restoring a collection of Renaissance manuscripts. It was a dream opportunity. Yet, as she walked into the Astrolabe to tell Julian, the acceptance letter in her pocket felt like a stone. She found him exactly where they had first met, standing by the unfinished map of Ethelgard. When she told him about Rome, the silence that followed wasn't the comfortable quiet they were used to. It was heavy, aching. 3 months, Julian said quietly, his eyes fixed on the map. Yes, Elara replied, her voice trembling slightly. I leave in 2 weeks. Julian finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes held a storm of emotions he couldn't quite voice. He nodded slowly. That is a wonderful opportunity, Elara. I'm happy for you. But he didn't look happy, and Elara felt a tear slip down her cheek. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of packing and painful, polite distance. Their evenings on the floor of the shop were replaced by brief, awkward encounters. The unspoken words between them piled up, a wall of glass separating 2 people desperate to reach out. Finally, it was her last night in the city. The rain had returned, a soft, melancholy drizzle. Elara stood outside the Astrolabe, her suitcase in the trunk of a waiting cab. She had to say goodbye. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The brass bell chimed, sounding mournful in the empty shop. The lights were dimmed. Julian was standing at his counter. He looked up, and for a second his carefully composed expression broke. You're leaving, he said. I wanted to say goodbye, Elara whispered, stepping closer. Julian stepped out from behind the counter. He walked toward her, but he didn't stop in front of her. He walked past her, toward the back of the shop, to the unfinished map of Ethelgard. Before you go, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion, I need to show you something. Elara walked over, standing beside him. Remember when you said the artist hadn't finished the map because they hadn't found what they were looking for? He asked. I remember. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a fine-tipped calligraphy pen. He unscrewed the cap. Then, his hand hovering over the century-old, priceless parchment, he pressed the nib to the blank, yellowed corner. Elara gasped, reaching out to stop him. Julian, what are you doing? You'll ruin it. It was never ruined, he said softly, his eyes never leaving the paper. It was just waiting. With steady, deliberate strokes, Julian began to draw. He didn't draw southern districts or mythical mountains. In the empty space on the map, he drew a tiny, perfect sketch of an antique shop. He drew a window. He drew a velvet armchair. And then above the tiny shop, he drew a compass rose. But the arrows didn't point north, south, east, and west. The elegant, sweeping letters at the end of the arrows spelled out a single word. Home. Julian capped the pen and finally turned to face her. The space between them was gone. I spent my whole life surrounded by maps, Julian whispered, his hands coming up to gently cup her face. Always looking for a direction, always wondering where I was supposed to be, but the moment you walked into this shop, Elara, my compass stopped spinning. Tears spilled freely down Elara's cheeks. You can go to Rome, Julian said, his thumbs brushing away her tears. You can go to the ends of the earth, but I needed you to know that this map is finally finished, because I found exactly what I was looking for. Elara looked up into his eyes, reading the absolute certainty in them. The glass wall between them shattered. She reached up, wrapping her arms around his neck, and pulled him down to her. The kiss tasted of salt and rain, of unspoken confessions and profound relief. It was a promise, sealed in the quiet warmth of a shop out of time. When they finally pulled apart, breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against one another, Elara smiled. 3 months, she whispered. Keep my velvet chair open. Julian smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached his eyes. I'll keep the whole shop open for you. Outside, the rain continued to whisper against the cobblestones. But inside the Astrolabe, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the quiet ticking of clocks, 2 lost travelers had finally found their way.